started about 10 days back, induction of labor. We started with this topic. So I will continue the same topic for today. Before that, did I give you any task or homework?
To engagement, descent, flexion, internal rotation, extension, external rotation, restitution, and expulsion.
Yeah, you tell a little slowly, no? I don't know if your friends caught it or not. So,
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
Engagement is movement of the presenting part below the plane of the pelvic inlet. Engaging process starts at the last few weeks of pregnancy to the period of starting of labor.
Little slow in your representation. So, the first cardinal movement during labor is engagement. Yes. So, engagement is defined as entry of the presenting part through the brim of the pelvis, isn't it?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Yeah. So, here what are important for the engagement to occur? What are the diameters on the fetus?
Biparietal diameter should be 9.5 centimeters.
Okay. What else? What are the other diameters on the fetal skull or fetal presenting part that are important for a good engagement?
Anteroposterior diameter, which is suboccipitobregmatic, should also be 9.5 centimeters.
Yes. So in the normal vertex presentation, if you take the mechanism of labor for a normal vertex presentation, the anteroposterior diameter, suboccipitobregmatic, which is about 9.5 centimeters, is the one that is getting engaged. Okay. So the engagement is occurring usually in this diameter, isn't it? Yes. What else?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Ma'am,
So
next step
is the engaging? Yeah. 1 second. Is the engaging diameter the same for all presentations or it is different?
It can be different, ma'am.
Yes. So is biparietal diameter the same or different? It will be the same. So that is the reason when we are taking the engaging diameter into consideration, we usually give importance to the anteroposterior diameters rather than transverse diameters of the fetal skull. See whether it is face presentation, row presentation, or vertex presentation. The biparietal diameter is the same 9.5 centimeters, which is not changing. But the anteroposterior diameter, that is varying depending upon the amount of flexion, amount of extension of the fetal head. So, for us to consider normal labor, the anteroposterior engaging diameters are important. So, this point is important for the step of engagement. Yes, next.
Okay, ma'am. In primary gravidae, engagement occurs in significant number of cases before the onset of labor, while in multipare, the same may occur in the late first stage with rupture of the membranes.
Okay, good. Yes.
Next step is descent, ma'am. Movement of the presenting part down through the curve of the birth canal. This is the result of pressure of the amniotic fluid, direct pressure of the fundus upon the breech with contraction, bearing down the effect of maternal abdominal muscle, and extension and straightening of the fetal body.
Yes. Okay, good. Next.
Next step is flexion, ma'am. While some degree of flexion of the head is noticeable at the beginning of labor, but complete flexion is rather uncommon. Flexion is achieved either due to resistance offered by the unfolding cervix, the walls of the pelvis, or by the pelvic floor.
Okay. Why should flexion be there?
Because so the diameter is reduced, ma'am, so the fetal head can pass through the vulva.
Is it? One second. Can I ask other people to please mute their mics? I see some other disturbance. I can hear some other disturbance. You please, all of the people will mute their mics except for me and the person who is presenting. Others, please mute their mics. Okay, continue, doctor.
Yes, ma'am. So flexion functionally creates a smaller structure to pass through the maternal pelvis.
Yes, yeah, pelvis. Pelvis is a limited area, isn't it? Bone cannot expand much. So by flexion, by increasing flexion, as the fetal head is descending, there is increasing flexion happening that will allow smallest of the smallest diameters to pass through the cavity of the pelvis. Yes, good. Continue.
Okay, ma'am. Rotation of the position. Next step is internal rotation. Rotation of the position of the fetal head in the mid pelvis from transverse to anterior posterior position. It is essential for the completion of labor.
Yes. Yeah.
And next step is extension. Movement of fetal chin away.
Yeah, one second. Tell something
Okay.
about internal rotation. Where is it occurring? What factors are helping in this internal rotation? Through how many degrees it is happening? These all points are important. Tell me.
The theories which explain the anterior rotation of the occiput are slope of the pelvic floor, pelvic shape, law of unequal flexibility.
Yes.
Prerequisites of anterior internal rotation are well-flexed head, efficient uterine contraction, favorable shape at the mid-pelvic plane, and tone of the levator ani muscle.
Yes. Good. Excellent. At what level is it occurring? Can you tell me? Internal
The
rotation is
level
occurring
at which internal rotation occurs is variable. Rotation in the cervix, although favorable, is a less frequent occurrence. In majority of cases, rotation occurs at the pelvic floor. Rarely it occurs as late as crowning of the head.
So, where is the pelvic floor located? Any bony landmark?
Pubic symphysis.
No? At the level of the ischial spines. So, usually the rotation in majority of the cases occurs at the level of the ischial spines because the pelvic floor is located. You know, one factor helping in anterior internal rotation is the contractions of the pelvic floor. Okay, so pelvic floor or your levator ani muscle is located at the level of the ischial spines. So internal rotation anteriorly is occurring at the level of ischial spines. And in majority of the cases, it is anterior rotation that has to happen so that delivery is successfully occurring vaginally. Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Next step is crowning. After internal rotation, further descent occurs until the subocciput lies underneath the pubic arch. At this stage, the maximum diameter of the head, which is the biparietal diameter, stretches the vulval outlet without any recession of the head even after the contraction is over. This is called crowning.
Yeah.
Then extension. Delivery of the head takes place by extension through the couple of force theory. The successive parts of the fetal head to be born through the stretched vulval outlet of vertex, brow, and face. Immediately following the release of the chin through the anterior margin of the stretched perineum, the head drops down, bringing the chin in close proximity to the maternal anal opening.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Continue.
Next step is restitution. It is the visible passive movement of the head due to untwisting of the neck sustained during internal rotation. Occiput points to the maternal thigh of the corresponding side to which it originally lay.
Yes.
Next, which is a part of restitution, is external rotation. It is a movement of rotation of the head visible externally due to internal rotation of shoulders. Occiput points directly towards the maternal thigh, corresponding to the side to which it originally directed at the time of engagement.
Yes. Okay.
Then after that, after external rotation, there's birth of shoulders and trunk because they lie in anterior posterior diameter position, so it will be easy for
so easy slipping of the rest of the body. So the main movements are at the level of the fetal head, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
So the rest of the body, the trunk and rest of the limbs are all soft parts. So there's not much difficulty and it is quickly born once the head has delivered out. The rest of the body will simply follow. So expulsion of the baby is the last movement that happens. Good. You have elaborated it very well.
Thank you.
Good. Congratulations and a virtual clap for you. So nice. Thank you that you obliged to my request and you presented it. Very good. Now these movements are very, very important. And all of you please have a clear idea about the cardinal movements of normal labor, because in the exam for the afternoon viva, when they give you the maternal pelvis and the fetal skull or the dummy baby model, they'll ask you to demonstrate these movements. Okay. So this hands-on practice, we can have it later when we physically meet each other. But right now, at least if you can memorize the steps in the mechanism of labor, it is sufficient. So you please read up, all of you, and your friend has elaborated very well. Now he seems to be having a very good idea. So all of you also, if you read many times, you will understand it properly and you will tell it systematically. Good. The other candidate 132.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, you're ready with your topic of living ligatures?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, quickly tell that.
Uterus has 3 layers, that is the outer serosa, middle myometrium, and the inner endometrium. The middle myometrium is a smooth muscle layer, and it is the thickest layer. And again, it is arranged in 3 layers, that is the outer longitudinal layer and the inner circular layer, and the middle layer, it has mesh-like fibers, and it runs in a crisscross manner. In between these gaps, blood vessels pass in between them, and blood vessels pass in between these gaps, and the middle layer is also called as the living ligature. That is because after the delivery, when the uterus contracts along with the myometrium, the middle layer also contracts, and because of this contraction, the arterioles which are running through the middle layer of the myometrium are also clamped, and this constricts the blood vessels in between them, and hence it stops bleeding. Normally in any surgery, to stop a bleeding we apply a ligature, but here, since there's a natural ligature, we call this middle layer of the myometrium as the living ligature. And when uterus loses its tone, or when it becomes atonic and it is unable to contract, or there is insufficient contraction, it causes prolonged labor and atonic postpartum hemorrhage.
Yes, good, very good. Shirley, you also elaborate very well. So living ligatures are naturally occurring structures in the form of the middle layer of the myometrium, which is compressing the blood vessels running within it. Okay, so these living ligatures function is very, very important for every normal delivery or for even cesarean section, to reduce the amount of blood loss, the inevitable blood loss that occurs after a delivery, isn't it? Yeah, so very good. So for you also, a virtual clap. So very nice. I'm happy that both of you, Shirley and Ilyas, both of you have done an excellent job. Very good. Thank you. Anything, anybody else want to contribute anything? Okay. So let's go to the topic of induction of labor. So today again, I'll give for 2 more students. I want 2 more volunteers. At the end of my class, I'll give 2 more topics to come prepared and present in the next session. So that like this, you will revise some topics or the other, and you'll have a target for you people to read. That's my logic behind these, giving these topics for you. Okay. So I think if you can recall, we started with the definition of induction of labor. Then we briefly read about the historical aspects. Then we saw the indications for induction, both maternal, fetal, and majority of them are combined indications. And we also finished the contraindications for induction of labor. Now let us see what are complications. So before going to the actual techniques of induction of labor, we will first finish off the complications and then go further for various techniques of induction of labor. Are you able to see my slides?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So audibility is also clear, isn't it?
Yes, ma'am. Clear.
Okay. Thank you. So if you see the complications, you can group the complications into maternal complications and fetal complications. So you know, induction of labor is a procedure being done on the pregnant woman. So naturally, it may have some complications if you do not perform it as per the protocols. So what are the maternal complications? The very first complication could be a failed induction. Like, in spite of your method, see, we have many methods of induction of labor. In spite of selecting an ideal method for induction of labor, sometimes the woman may not set into labor at all. Okay, and as such, there is no reason or explanation that can be given clear-cut in these cases. So maybe the endogenous receptors for oxytocin action are poor. Okay, so or there is some other prostaglandin endogenously occurring prostaglandin deficiency. So whatever may be the reason, the woman may not be setting into labor. So that is the meaning of failed induction. The process itself may not result in a successful onset of labor. It is not simply if the woman fails to deliver. Okay, I don't mean to say that failed induction is when the woman cannot deliver vaginally. What I meant when I said failed induction is the process, whatever mechanism or method you used for induction, did not result in onset of labor pains at all. Okay, I'm not bothered whether she successfully delivered vaginally or we had to convert her labor into cesarean section. Okay, what I mean is the process did not happen with my drug or with my method that I adopted. That is the meaning of failed induction. Then, second complication is cord prolapse. Now, in induction of labor, you are artificially inducing labor pains, and due to some reason, the membranes have ruptured even before the actual onset of active phase of labor. In last session, we had a discussion as to ideally when the membranes should rupture. Do you remember if the last session, if you remember, we discussed as to the membrane should rupture ideally after active stage of labor or after 4 to 5 centimeters of cervical dilatation and with considerable fetal descent. But if the head is high up, it has not entered pelvis, and with your induction mechanism, there may be sudden severe uterine contractions causing sudden rupture of membranes, and a loop of cord may prolapse out. So this will cause birth asphyxia to the baby. So sudden artificial rupture of membranes, can occur and can cause cord prolapse. So that is one complication. Another one is a prolonged labor. See, normally every woman should have nature deciding the onset of labor. The process of labor should happen as per nature's decision, isn't it? But in women who are not having a natural mechanism of onset of labor, only you are doing induction. So in that situation, what happens? You are not knowing why you do, still in spite of so much of technology, you do not know why a particular woman is not able to set into labor even after 40 weeks. Okay. So in that situation, you are just empirically trying some medication from outside, some methods from outside to stimulate her to set into labor. So in that process, you do not know whether single dose of the medication or multiple doses are required or which method is good for which patient. All that is not under the control of the obstetrician. Okay, so you may be just trying different methods. So in that process, the process of onset of labor, the process of labor pains, then delivery may take many days. So that is the reason there is a risk of prolonged labor with the induction of labor. Okay, so 2 days, 3 days, the woman may continue to be waiting for onset of labor. It may be like that. See, other day we had a case, we had to induce labor pains because that woman was a case of gestational diabetes. She was around 39 weeks of gestation. We didn't want her to go beyond 40 weeks. And since the sugars are under control, we thought we'll deliver her by 39 weeks. And we started the process of induction of labor on Tuesday. Then again on Wednesday also we had to give one more drug. Then again on Thursday also we had to give 2 more drugs. So like that the process went on from Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and successfully she delivered on Thursday night. So like that it was a prolonged phase of labor. Okay, so that doesn't happen always for every patient. Some patients within few hours of starting the process they may set into labor and deliver happily. So like that, but this complication of prolonged labor you should keep in mind when you start the process of labor, and patient cooperation will be there if you tell her properly as to why you are waiting, why she is not setting into labor. So this patient, which I just now gave you the example, was very cooperative. She agreed to and allowed us also to try different methods. And she was also happy when she ultimately set into labor after 2 to 3 days of prolonged waiting. Otherwise, patients tend to become anxious. Patients' attendants also anxious. What is this? You're just waiting. Something may happen to the mother. Something may happen to the baby. Like that, they may be having some apprehensions. So this prolonged labor is a common complication which you should keep in mind with the process of induction of labor. Then there's another condition called abruption. What is abruption or abruptio placenta? Anybody? Between 1 to 10? Anybody, can you tell me what is abruptio placenta? 1 to 10, all are absent. So I am marking here 1 to 10, all will be absent. See, if you don't respond to the questions, if you don't interact me when I want you to interact, I am marking them absent, even if you are sitting in front of the systems and have simply logged in without any active participation. Is my point clear? So 1 to 10, anybody? Okay, all are absent. 11 to 20? Anybody? 11 to 20. What is abruptio placenta? 21 to 30? Between
Ma'am,
the longest-
rupture of the placenta from the detachment of placenta from the womb before delivery.
Who is it? What is your roll number, doctor?
25, ma'am.
25. Okay. So you repeat again your words.
Detachment of the placenta before the delivery.
Yeah, so good. So detachment or separation of the placenta before the actual time. You all know that. When should placenta separate, doctor? Tell me. Ideally, when
half
should
an
the
hour after the
delivery of the
fetus.
baby.
Baby.
So in labor, okay, it should separate in labor, that too after delivery of the baby. After second stage is over, in third stage only the placenta should separate and get expelled, isn't it? That is a normal thing. Whereas in abruptio placenta, even before the onset of labor pains, okay, during antepartum period only, there is separation of a normally located placenta. So that is good, doctor. So I am happy that somebody answered correctly. So abruptio placenta. So this is a common complication that can again happen with induction of labor. How it is causing, how a method of induction of labor is causing this premature separation of placenta, we will see as I proceed with my later slides. Then just keep this in mind. Then another complication is an abnormal uterine action. Okay, so what did I mean when I said abnormal uterine action as a complication of induction? See, whatever method you are using should induce labor pains, and those labor pains in intensity and frequency, they should mimic natural labor pains. Okay, that is a normal uterine action. And that is what, as an obstetrician, I will expect the uterus to respond when I start a method of induction. But due to some reason, due to an hyperstimulation of the uterus, or due to an unexpected overreaction to the little medication that we gave, sometimes the uterus may have hyperstimulated uterine contractions or understimulation. That means hypotonia also may be there. Not the required amount of action may be there. Less action will be there. Less uterine contraction intensity will be there. So either ways, it could be either hyper or hypo, okay, or incoordinate. That means there is no coordinated or a proper frequency or intensity of uterine contraction. So there's an incoordinate. So all these types of bizarre behaviors of the uterus can be there, and we label all these things as abnormal uterine action following induction. So this is also again a common complication of induction of labor. Then increased operative interference. Another complication is an increased operative interference. See, I said when we start the process of labor, if you see the definition, see, I'll just go back and show you the definition of induction of labor. See, here, when I start the process of induction, my aim is to initiate the process of labor and also complete the process of delivery. Okay, that completion of the process of delivery could be vaginally or by cesarean section, but sometimes she has to deliver. I just don't want her to continue the pregnancy anymore. So that is there in my mind when I start the process of induction. So what happens, as I said, there could be risk of prolonged labor. So 1 day, 2 days, I may be waiting. 3 days are also over, but she's not able to set into labor. Or labor pains have started, but she's not able to deliver vaginally. So something may go wrong and make me interfere in that process and decide for a cesarean section for a quick delivery of the baby. Or even if she's setting into normal labor, progressing for a vaginal delivery, After prolonged waiting for 1 or 2 days, the woman may be exhausted or tired. So she may not be able to give the last push that is required for second stage of delivery of the baby. So in those situations, I am forced to help her by putting an outlet forceps or a vacuum or a ventouse. So that is what I meant when I said there's an increased operative interference. It's like a tired horse. So with the prolonged period of induction of labor, one more complication that you should anticipate is increased operative interference, either in the form of an instrumental delivery or in the form of a cesarean section. Okay, so this is also another common maternal complication. Another one is a postpartum hemorrhage. So postpartum hemorrhage is nothing but excessive bleeding after delivery of the baby, excessive bleeding from the uterine cavity after delivery of the baby and placenta. Normally, some amount of inevitable blood loss, about 200 ml, 300 ml, maximum 500 ml, does occur following a normal delivery or following a cesarean section. That is called inevitable blood loss. But if the amount of blood loss is beyond this volume, then it is called as postpartum hemorrhage. And again, in cases of induction of labor, the risk of postpartum hemorrhage is also high. Why? We will see later on. Then again, maternal morbidity. Okay. Now, repeated parvaginal examinations, repeated interventions. Okay. That itself can cause some infection to the mother. She can start developing some sepsis or fever. That is what I meant when I said maternal morbidity. Sickness, some sickness may be there after the process of labor or delivery. Then last is psychological upset. Why is there psychological upset? Can anybody tell me? Psychological upset to whom? Tell me, who is upset by this process of induction of labor? Who all are upset? Anybody can answer this. Are you all there with me, or there is some connectivity issue? (21 to 40, 30, 21 to 30). Anybody can take this question?
And the family members and the mother.
Yeah, family members. Then who else? Anybody else can contribute any other point? Who else is upset?
Mother, ma'am.
Patient, yes, the mother, the laboring woman, the woman who is expecting delivery, yes. Who else? That's all? Family members and mother? The poor doctor also, the obstetrician is also stressed out, no? She's waiting. You forgot about the doctor. So, the obstetrician also may be under stress, okay? Because she has been waiting, she has been inducing with different methods, but none of them are resulting in successful delivery or onset of labor pains also. So the obstetrician is also at stress. So leave aside the obstetrician's distress. Just consider the mother and the family members. So there will be a lot of psychological or stress on the part of the family members and the laboring woman. They'll be anxious. So all these are the commonly anticipated complications with the process of induction of labor. Then, seeing the fetal complications, what all fetal complications can you anticipate? Just do some wild guess. What fetal complications can be there? 31 to 40, anybody? What fetal complications can be there?
Asphyxia.
Asphyxia, yes, good. What else? Yes, so as one of you said, asphyxia or fetal distress. Okay, so fetal distress can be there. See, when I said there is hypertonic uterine contractions, the uterus is contracting more than the required. Then naturally, with each contraction, just now one of Shirley told us that there are living ligatures. These living ligatures are also compressing the blood vessels during the process of labor pains also, not only after delivery. Whenever the uterus is contracting, the myometrium is contracting, the living ligatures are compressing the blood vessels running. So even during labor, temporarily the blood supply is getting decreased, or for a few seconds it is getting cut off. So whenever there is more than the required intense contractions of the uterus, this compression is too much or for a longer duration also, causing like throttling of the neck of the baby. How you feel when your neck is throttled? You feel so much asphyxiated, or having the requirement for air hunger. So like that, even the fetus will have same type of asphyxia manifested as fetal distress. Okay, the fetal heart will be changing, will be dipping, the fetal heart will be falling. That is only called fetal distress. So fetal distress is a common problem with the induction of labor when you don't monitor the case properly, or when you don't look for those abnormal uterine contractions. Okay, then iatrogenic prematurity. What did I mean when I said iatrogenic prematurity is always we do induction of labor after fetal viability is established. Preferably, you will do induction of labor at term gestation only. So, by all methods, from LMP, from ultrasound investigation values, you will check whether woman has reached term gestation or not, and then only you think of inducing labor pains. But due to some reason, if the obstetrician did not calculate the gestation age correctly, or the calculation there was some error, then this problem of iatrogenic prematurity can occur, and you may deliver a baby which is not yet 37 to 39 weeks. It may be just 36 weeks or 34 weeks like that. But nowadays, with wide availability of ultrasound and more than one times you are doing ultrasound, this risk of iatrogenic prematurity is less in modern obstetrics. Then perinatal morbidity. What did I say mean when I said perinatal morbidity is again increased operative interference, prolonged duration of labor. All these things can cause some sepsis even to the baby. Okay, some infection to the baby, and that will lead to perinatal morbidity. Then hyperbilirubinemia and jaundice. See, some of the drugs that you use for induction of labor, they themselves can cause some hyperbilirubinemia to the neonate, or the sepsis that is there in the baby following the prolonged duration of labor itself can cause hyperbilirubinemia and jaundice. So these are the fetal complications. Then, now let us go to the actual technique of induction of labor. Before that, let us see what are the prerequisites that you should check before actually inducing labor pains. Can you just contribute some points to this? What are the prerequisites for induction of labor? What you should check before you actually proceed for induction? 31 to 40 roll numbers, anybody? Between 31 to 40, anybody would like to add any point?
Gestation age, ma'am.
Good, gestation age. Anybody else? 31 to 40? Between 31 to 40 roll numbers? Pardon? Please repeat. Presentation. Excellent. Presentation. Good. 41 to 50? Roll numbers 41 to 50. Any point you want to add? Okay, so I will tell some more things. First, review the indication for induction. Just check, is it the right case for induction of labor? Okay, so review the indication for induction. So I previously in my slides, I told there are some maternal indications, fetal indications, and combined indications for induction. So before actually proceeding for induction, I have to again review the indication for induction. Should I induce or shall I wait? Once more, I will review the indication. Then review again the contraindications for labor induction. Is the pelvis okay? Is the weight of the baby sufficient for this size of the pelvis? So is the mother having any contraindications like heart disease where you are not supposed to be inducing? Is there any scar on the uterus like previous cesarean section where induction should be done cautiously? So I will again check for all these contraindications. Or is a woman allergic to some drugs that I am going to give as induction. So all these things I will check. So check for contraindications for labor induction. Then assess the weight of the fetus. Okay, by ultrasound. That is the best way of assessing the fetal weight. Now, any clinical bedside method of assessing fetal weight, can you tell me? Is there any formula for assessing the fetal weight? Can anybody tell me, is there any formula for easy bedside estimation of fetal weight apart from your ultrasound? What is Johnson formula? Anybody? Okay, you please refer and tell me in the next class. What is this Johnson formula? How is it helping us to estimate the fetal weight clinically? Okay, so check the weight of the fetus. Okay, then also the fetal well-being by doing something called NST. What is NST?
Non-stress test, ma'am.
Good. So recently your senior batch, the ones who have appeared for exam last month, they had a 4 marks question on antepartum fetal surveillance. Okay, so NST or non-stress test is one of the methods of antepartum fetal surveillance. Antepartum. It is a test done when the woman is not in labor. Okay, you want to know whether fetus is having any intrauterine hypoxic damage to the brain. That is what this non-stress test is telling us. Whether baby is having good blood supply, whether baby is suffering from any hypoxia in that intrauterine environment. So that is how the NST will help us to know and decide for fitness for labor, onset of labor. Then screen for any risk factors in the mother. Then, as some of you told, confirm the gestation age and maturity of the fetus. How will you know the maturity of the fetus? What are the various ways to know the maturity of the fetus?
Ma'am, based on the organ development and
How will you know the organ development? Do you think by ultrasound can you know organ development? No. Not organ development. Tell something else which will help us to know the maturity of the fetus. Okay. See, from LMP, you can calculate the gestational age. Suppose if the gestational age is almost 38 and beyond, from LMP, from ultrasound, you see that the gestational age of the pregnancy or the fetus is beyond 37, 38 weeks. Almost 39 to 40 weeks means the fetus is mature enough to survive outside on its own with no support. That means that maturity is basically estimating the maturity of the lungs. Okay, the lung maturity is more important for us because if the lungs are fully mature only, they will expand, the baby will be able to breathe and the baby will be able to survive outside without any support. Okay, so from the ultrasound, the calculation of gestational age, you can know whether the fetus is fully mature. Plus placental maturity. Suppose the placenta is already grade 3 mature placenta. That itself will tell that it is a term fetus, a fully mature fetus. So like that, you can know the maturity of the fetus. And in olden days, they were doing lecithin sphingomyelin ratio estimation of the amniotic fluid. They would tap the amniotic fluid and check the lecithin sphingomyelin ratio to know whether adequate surfactant is there in the fetal lungs or not. But nowadays, with the availability of ultrasound, this invasive procedure of taking amniotic fluid and doing lecithin sphingomyelin ratio is no longer done. Okay, but that is supposed to be the best way. But being an invasive procedure, it is not done now. Your ultrasound itself is sufficient. Then again assess the amniotic fluid index by ultrasound and see whether amniotic fluid is decreasing or present adequately. Then do a clinical pelvimetry. What did I mean by clinical pelvimetry is by your pervaginal examination with your 2 fingers, the obstetrician will see whether pelvis is gynecoid and whether pelvic diameters are adequate for that size of the pelvis, size of the fetus. So like that, the gynecologist will exclude cephalopelvic disproportion and abnormal shape and size of the pelvis. So clinical pelvimetry will help us to know whether birth canal is adequate for normal delivery or not. That also you again check before you proceed for induction. Then do something called pre-induction cervical assessment. Now before the actual labor, you all know that there is a pre-labor phase lasting for 1 to 2 weeks before the actual labor pains. During this pre-labor phase, the cervix is undergoing so many ripening changes called pre-labor cervical ripening. Okay, the cervix is getting prepared for the process of labor. So because of these pre-labor cervical changes, the cervix is becoming soft, dilatable, and getting ready for the process of labor. So those changes should happen naturally only. Then only your method of induction of labor will successfully induce labor pains. The cervix is not ripe, if the cervix is not yet ready for labor, then your method of induction of labor will continue for many days or will not successfully result in labor. Okay, so checking for this pre-induction cervical ripening is very, very important. So that is also an important prerequisite that you should check before the actual induction. Then take the consent. So after you have checked all that checklist, see all this checklist you have checked, and now the obstetrician feels all these prerequisites are satisfied, then he or she wants to proceed for labor induction. So they will explain to the patient what you're going to do, what are the complications of that procedure, what are the outcome of that, all that you will explain, the do's and don'ts of it, the side effects, everything, and then you'll take a return consent of the patient as well as the attendant. So return informed consent of the patient and the attendant you will take before actually starting the method of induction. This is very, very important to save the obstetrician from any medico-legal litigations. Tomorrow, during the process of induction, some complication occurs causing maternal death, fetal death, then the obstetrician should not be blamed that wrong method has been applied or wrong method has been selected or wrong timing has happened or there was no indication for induction. So that type of allegation should not be there on the obstetrician. So the obstetrician should take precaution of taking a informed return consent. Then proper documentation of cervical ripening changes and the indication for induction also should be done by the obstetrician in the case sheet. So in the case sheet, the obstetrician will also document these things. Then the obstetrician will give order for preparation of the part. Then we'll ask the woman to take a soap water enema so that the bowels are emptied. Then patient will be put on a liquid diet or a semi-solid diet or a soft diet during the process of induction. Okay, so these are all the things that you will check before actually starting the process of induction. Now, before I go into the next technique of induction, let us see what is pre-induction cervical assessment or pre-induction cervical scoring, which we call it as Bishop's score. Okay, can you tell any other scores that you know with a proper name in relevant to my department? Concerned with labor, any other score that you know? Or concerned with labor itself, with regard to baby, what is that score that we are bothered?
Apgar score.
Very good, Apgar score, yes. So like this, like Bishop score, you also have something called Apgar score for the baby. Okay, so like that, for pre-labor cervical changes, there is something called Bishop score. Of late, this original Bishop score has been modified. So what you have now available to practice and what is there in your textbooks is a modified Bishop score. Okay, So now let us see what are components in this modified Bishop score. Now for calculating this Bishop score, you will take into consideration 4 cervical changes and 1 point regarding the presenting part or the fetus. Okay. So there are 5 points in this Bishop score. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 4 points are with regard to the cervix and 1 point is with regard to the fetus. What are these 4 points? One is cervical dilatation, cervical length, cervical consistency, cervical position, and lastly station of the presenting part. Now with regard to cervical dilatation, and again each point, each factor is given a score ranging from 0 to 3. Now for cervical dilatation, if the cervix is totally closed, the internal os is tightly closed, then you give a score of 0. Then if the cervical dilatation is between 1 to 2 centimeters, you give a score of 1. If the cervical dilatation is between 3 to 4 centimeters, you give a score of 2. And more than 5 centimeters, very good cervix, you give a score of 3. Like that only for cervix. The cervix is very long. The ripening has not occurred. Cervix is having a very long length, like a non-pregnant cervix, means that is more than 2 centimeter length, you give a score of 0. 1 to 2 will be 1. And less than 1 centimeter will be score of 2. And then no length of cervix. Cervix has totally shortened. That means cervix is fully effaced. Then you give a good score of 3. Now during pregnancy, you all know the cervix is, what is the consistency of a pregnant cervix? Anybody? How does a cervix feel during pregnancy? What is the feel when you touch the cervix during pregnancy? Anybody between 51 to 60, 61 to 70? Open to batch, entire batch. Anybody can take this question. What is the consistency of the pregnant cervix? Are you all there or you have logged out? What did you say, doctor? Please repeat. I didn't get you. Did you say it as firm?
Yes,
Firm?
ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
No, it is not firm.
Ma'am, soft cervix. Soft, ma'am.
Yes. See, one of the changes of pregnancy is extreme softening of the cervix. This extreme softening of the cervix is one of the signs of pregnancy, isn't it? It's signs of a pregnant uterus. So normally during pregnancy, the cervix should be very soft. But for some patients, for some women, in spite of a pregnancy and almost going up to term, the cervix may be having some firm consistency, no softening. Then it is a very bad cervix or a very poor score. So it is given a score of 0, and a very good or a favorable or a very soft cervix is given a score of 2. And then position. The cervix is present centrally placed. Then it is given a score of 1. And if it is pointing anteriorly, it is given a score of 2. Then if the fetal head or station is above the pelvic brim, the head has not entered pelvis at all. Again, it is a very bad point and the score will become 0. See, -3, -2, -1, 0 means these are with regard to the levels in the pelvis. Taking the ischial spines as 0 level. So if you see the pelvis, the ischial spines level is taken as 0 station. And all the levels above this 0 station up to pelvic brim will be minus. For each centimeter, it is -1, -2, -3. That means -3 means it is almost the level of the brim of the pelvis. And below the level of ischial spines, the score for every centimeter will be +1, +2, +3. +3 means almost it is at the introitus, ready for delivery. Okay. So higher the station, much far away from the 0 station, the score is supposed to be very poor. That means the head has not entered pelvis. The process of labor did not start at all. The head is very, very high up. Okay. So that is a very, very bad score. So if the head has entered pelvis, it is almost reaching ischial spines or zero station, then the score is a 2. And below that, the score will be very good and it is 3. So like this, you take all these points. So, and then you give a score and total it up. Now, are you having a doubt as to how are we taking these points or how are we checking on these factors? Anybody, can you tell me how are you checking on these factors? How are you checking on the dilatation, cervical length, consistency? Can anybody tell me? Is it some scale or something that I'm using and putting it inside the patient?
Number of fingers which can be passed through the cervix, ma'am.
Yeah. So during our parvaginal examination only, the obstetrician, when they are doing the parvaginal examination, you all know that we insert the index and middle fingers after wearing gloves and using a jelly. We insert the fingers into the vagina, and then in the vagina itself, you have the cervix pointing, no? So like that, you check with your vaginal fingers all these factors, including the station. So as your friend told, the number of fingers that you can insert into the cervical canal will help us to know if it is 1 finger, it is 1 centimeter dilated. If it is 2 fingers, you are able to pass 2 centimeters dilated. So like that, you calculate for these factors. Okay, good. So like this, you do a parvaginal examination and check on the Bishop score. And if the Bishop score is, total score will be 13. If the Bishop score is between 6 and 13, it is a very, very favorable score. Whatever method you are adopting, it will successfully result in labor pains. Whereas if the cervix score is between 0 and 5, very, very unfavorable cervix. The cervix did not have any pre-labor changes. So your method of induction is less likely to result in a normal delivery. So you may have to further wait for cervical changes, or by some methods you are going to improve the score. So that is how the Bishop score will help us to decide the mode of induction, success of your induction. Okay. So I think with this I'll stop here. Now Bishop score can be a short notes for you. It could be 2 marks question or a 4 marks question in the exam. So it's a very, very important topic. So I'll stop here. Any questions that you want to ask or get clarified? Okay, as you think of asking any questions, I want 2 people to volunteer between 100 and 110. 2 people to volunteer and talk to me about what are the phases of labor, or phases of parturition. Anybody between 100 to 110, can you tell me what are the phases of parturition? 101, are you there? Just a 5-minute stop before the next session. Yeah, 101. Good afternoon. Yeah. And what is your name, doctor?
I'm Vidhi.
Nidhi.
Vidhi with a V.
Okay. Vidhi. V for violin.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So Vidhi, so you will be talking to us for 5-10 minutes on phases of parturition. Okay. Yeah. Good. Anybody else? 105. Are you there? Anybody? Apart from 105, anybody? 106, 107? Another topic I am giving you. Tell me the factors initiating labor. What are the factors initiating labor? Anybody between 101, already she took the topic. 102 to 110. Anybody can take this topic? Okay. So I'll mark absent for all the people between 102 to 110. Then 91 to 100. Tell me, who is it?
110.
110, good. So you're volunteering to talk about factors influencing labor.
Okay, ma'am.
Yes?
Yes, ma'am.
So whether it could be your oxytocin hormone or some prostaglandins or whatever local things, or the cervix or nerve plexus that are stimulating labor, whatever it is, you please tell briefly for 5-10 minutes about the factors that are initiating labor process. Okay? Okay. So all others also can please read up. If they have missed some points, if these two speakers, you can please contribute. And if you read and come, you can understand better as to what these people are talking. And like that, you can finish reading one topic. Okay? So 101, 110, you please be ready for these two topics for the next session. So anybody want to ask anything? If you don't have any queries, I'll wind up the session. Is it okay, or you want to have some clarification? Okay then. Thank you all.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
This conference is no longer being recorded.